Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy, no. Mr. King. Mr. King, aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford, no. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan, aye. Ms. Lummis. Ms. Lummis, no. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Marshall. Mr. Marshall,
I vote
no. Mr. McConnell.
yes.
Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Merkley.
McConnell, you're a coward.
Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Ossoff, aye. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Padilla, aye. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Romney. Mr. Romney, aye. Ms. Rosen. Ms. Rosen, aye. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rounds, no. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Sass. Mr. Sass, aye. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, no. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Sinema, aye. Ms. Smith. Ms. Smith, aye. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tillis, no. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Tuberville, no. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Warnock. Mr. Warnock, aye. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, no. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, no. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, no.
Why did they call them out of order? How many is the total? I don't see any number. Do you see a number?
The yeas are 56 and the nays are 44, and then Elizabeth will have something for the week.
On this vote, the yeas are 56, the nays are 44, and pursuant to S. 47, the Senate having voted the affirmative on the foregoing question, the Senate shall proceed with the trial as provided under the provisions of that resolution.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent that the trial adjourn until 12 noon tomorrow, Wednesday, February 10th, and that this order also constitute the adjournment of the Senate.
Without objection, we shall stand in adjournment until noon tomorrow.
So there you have it, the vote in the U.S. Senate on whether or not proceeding is in accordance with the U.S. Constitution. 56 yes, 44 no. It's basically the same as the last time, although the yeses picked up one more Republican, 6 total. The new Republican is Senator Cassidy of Louisiana, joining Sass of Nebraska, Romney of Utah. Who else am I forgetting?
Susan Collins.
Susan Collins of Maine, and Murkowski of Alaska, and Toomey, of course, Pat Toomey of the Great Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And one of the biggest arguments, Abby, let me start with you, that one of the Trump attorneys made, Mr.